I'll be talking about U.S. sports gambling, covering multiple topics from legalization to regulation. I have a series of disclosures that are listed here with respect to multiple entities. And over the 20th century, there's been many changes in gambling, going from prohibition in the early part of the 20th century to casinos expanding in Las Vegas in the 1930s, state lotteries beginning in New Hampshire in the 1960s, and then the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act permitted casino expansion in the late 80s to early 90s that led in part to the National Gambling Study Commission Act. And during that time period, in the late part of the 20th century, the country went green to having largely no casino games and lotteries in 1970s to in the late 1990s having many states with casino forms of gambling and lotteries. So as mentioned, this led to the National Gambling Impact Study Commission Act that led to several studies, including a report by the National Academy of Science, as well as NIH funding and large-scale studies like the National Epidemiological Survey of Alcohol and Related Conditions. And based on data that were accumulated, gambling disorder was reconsidered, moving from an impulse control disorder to a behavioral addiction. This led to a shift in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, moving gambling disorder in 2013 together with substance use disorders in a substance-related and addictive disorders category. There were other changes that occurred, including changes in thresholding and changes in the inclusionary and exclusionary criteria. And these were largely based on syntheses of data that had been accumulated over time. However, a big change that's happened in the gambling environment in the United States within the past 10 years is the Supreme Court declaring the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act unconstitutional. And in this setting, states began to introduce legislation in 2019 to legalize sports gambling. And several years later, by 2021, a majority of states had legalized sports gambling. And so should we be concerned about sports gambling, and particularly in the setting of internet gambling? Online sports gambling in the early part of this millennium had more than tripled over approximately an 8 to 10 year period. And similarly, this occurred with internet gambling, where the market went from 20 billion in 2009 to over 60 billion in 2020. So are there specific features that are related to internet gambling? Going back 15 to 20 years, we asked about internet gambling in our high school survey, found that internet gambling was linked to more features of problem gambling. There were stronger links with poor academic performance and heavy alcohol use among this high school student group. And importantly, gambling with friends was less strongly associated with problem gambling features among the internet gambling group, suggesting that this was a more isolative behavior. What we had also seen was a relative decline in high school gambling over the course of a 10-year period that coincided with the post-poker phenomenon years to the onset of daily fantasy sports, where one saw perhaps a bit of a bump going from 2017 to 2019 with respect to high school gambling participation. And daily fantasy sports by 2019 had become commonplace within the United States. Most states had daily fantasy sports. And the daily fantasy sports operator were in a good position to move into the sports gambling market. Other groups have moved into the sports gambling market. some media companies like ESPN. They've also advertised sports gambling through shows that focus on betting, like The Daily Wager. There's been an increase in promotional advertisements for sports gambling from movie celebrities as well as sports stars. And there are also advertisements for bonus bets or risk-free bets that may be enticing to some individuals. Then there are also advertisements for potentially more complex forms of bets like parlays, where one needs to win multiple bets in a row in order to win the wager. So should we be concerned about these changes in sports gambling, given also a sporting culture, particularly for young males, and the internet access that allows for geographic and time barriers to be removed to place bets? And in the setting of Connecticut legalizing sports gambling, the calls to the Connecticut Council Gambling Helpline have increased by 90%, largely regarding young males with gambling problems. And so, in this setting, Time Magazine had an article about the explosion in sports betting driving gambling addiction among college students. It was estimated in a meta-analysis that 1 in 10 college students had a gambling problem, and that nearly 60% of college students have bet on sports, and 4% do so daily. And the amount of money that um, the downloading of the apps that has occurred over time has increased. And this is a listing from 2021 to 2023, month by month, of downloading of the most popular sports betting apps. And this has occurred in the setting of major sports gambling groups advertising heavily, where in the US, sports gambling TV ads now total over $300 million annually. And in this setting, there are reports of individuals like this 33-year-old man from Toronto who said that, "I wish I had a casino gambling hobby. Then you have to leave your house and go to the casino and bet. Now you can be sitting on the toilet and deposit an infinite amount of money." In this setting, he accumulated over $200,000 in debt, is now going to GA and seeing a therapist, turning over his finances to his mother, and worries about relapsing on a daily basis. He also reported using cryptocurrencies because those would be more rapid forms of betting. And so, are we in some ways repeating what has happened in the past? This is a lithograph from Puck magazine in the late 19th century, which demonstrates sports phrenology. And one of the competitor magazine judge talked about, or had the lithograph centerfold about the how sport is degraded by gambling. And going back now over 100 years, there were sports gambling scandals in baseball, where the Black Sox threw the World Series, and Pete Rose from betting when he was either playing or managing baseball teams, being excluded or banned from baseball. And currently, there is an NBA player who is being considered for being banned, given betting irregularities relating to some of his individual game performances. There have been other scandals. More recently, Shohei Ohtani's interpreter apparently stole $16 million to gamble on illegal betting sites, and having bet over $183 million during this span, winning back over 140, but losing $40 million. So how can we break this cycle? One way is to help individuals get treatment. Behavioral therapies are the mainstay, and cognitive behavioral therapy has the arguably the most empirical support, although there are other forms and other interventions available, like self-help groups like GA. Um, what we are embarking on is developing an app to deliver cognitive behavioral therapy to enhance the delivery and the scope of reach of delivering effective therapies to individuals. We have We're currently in the phase of hiring actors and actresses and yeah, for the modules on the app, and this is the QR code if people are interested in following progress on the app development. There are also new forms of treatment like neuromodulation that hold promise but do not have FDA approval for gambling disorder, and similarly, medications do not have FDA indications. So are there ways that we can learn from other substances, for example, with respect to tobacco regulation, where removing tobacco vending machines, so limiting youth exposure, limiting advertisement, increasing taxation, and other approaches have been helpful with respect to reducing um, tobacco use and funding efforts to prevent, intervene, and understand. So recently, a bill was introduced to propose a ban on sportsbook advertising, modeled after the Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act that was passed in 1965. The Gambling Recovery and Investment and Treatment Act has been also been proposed to set aside some of the federal sports excise tax revenues to fund programs for gambling addiction prevention, treatment, and research. So for a number of years in the US, gambling science has had a gambling problem, according to the pages of Nature. And currently, there is very little funding invested in gambling disorder treatment, particularly when compared to substance use disorder treatment. And this occurs in the setting of state revenues being estimated at over $27 billion as of close to a decade ago. So we believe that this holds true for a wide range of behavioral addictions. And we believe that it will be important for us to consider the current sports gambling landscape in order to promote public health. And I'd like to thank a large number of individuals and thank you for your attention. And we may have some time for some questions if there are any in the chat.
I don't, this is Shane. I don't see any questions yet. So, but yeah, we have a couple minutes. If people want to put them in, I can happy to read them to you.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
If there are no questions, we can always move to our next presenter, who is Alex Russell from Central Queensland University in Australia, who will speak on how technology. Okay.
We have one question, so let's do that and then we'll jump in. So one question for you, Mark. Do you believe sports gambling should be outright banned for pro and amateur athletes?
That's a really good question. And it, it is something where one is in some ways playing with fire. Certainly not betting on the sport that an individual is playing, I think should be strongly considered. Um, and yeah, if one is betting on other sports outside of the domain in which they're playing, that might seem a little more of a gray zone. But I think it's an area that should be actively discussed. I think there have been a number of sports betting scandals, some just a few that I mentioned. But in the setting of the Protection of Amateur and Professional Sports Act being overturned, within a year, the NCAA convened a meeting because they were concerned about student athletes being particularly vulnerable to getting ensnared in some sort of uh, improper gambling. So I think that this is an area that does warrant consideration and discussion. And I'd be interested in the other panelists' view on this.
If I can jump in, I'd say it's definitely a case for particularly betting on your own contest. So in Australia, a lot of athletes are not allowed to bet matches they're playing in for fairly obvious reasons, but are still allowed to bet on other things. In my talk in a sec, I'll talk about one form of gambling, which is called micro betting, where you can bet on very specific events within a game, and it makes it easier to throw that particular without losing the entire game for your team as well. So there's more and more opportunities to cheat and make money from gambling here too. So certainly while they're playing, there's a good case for it.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have a super strong answer. I know that lots of athletes are betting and are gambling when they're not supposed to, or they're forbid. So I think it's definitely happening quite a bit actually. So I think that has to be somehow resolved. I think there has to be some way to address it because it is happening. I work with athletes and they're having their friends place the bets for them and lots of stuff. So the betting is continuing regardless of whether it's banned or not. So yeah.
There's also the longer term harm for them too. These are all competitive people, often young men with lots of money all of a sudden and not much else to do. So they can spend a lot of what they make and blow all this comes their way too. So there's harm that way too.
Great. Well, thank you. Are there any more questions in the Q&A?
I did not see any, so I think we'll keep going. Nope, none so far. I'll let you know. So, okay.
Wonderful, thank you. So our next speaker is Alex Russell, who is from Central Queensland University in Australia, who will be speaking on how technology has changed sports betting in Australia.
Thank you. So, and should be coming through there now. I hope. Good. Okay, so I'm presenting on what's happened in Australia sports and giving a bit of a historical perspective to try and show, what some lessons what some changes that we're seeing here and what lessons might for jurisdictions that are legislation now. I'm from the Gambling Research Laboratory. This is a COVID photo of us. We haven't all caught up for a while. And the core of the team here, who I want to point out, are Professor Matthew Rockloff, Professor Matthew Brown, and Professor Nerily Hing, who are really behind a lot of what we do, and I'm really lucky to be able to work with them. So today I'm going to cover how sports betting developed in Australia over time, and why we have possibly surprising restrictions in place compared to our other games. And what's happened since sports betting's come in that technology has allowed, what changes in terms of particularly access and the products that are offered. In doing so, I'll also try and highlight some challenges here for legislators who are looking at making laws around betting at the moment. So for context, Australia is a really big thing. Per capita, the biggest losers worldwide. And a large amount of this is due to this part of this graph, which is the pokies. Some pokies, EGMs, slots, and we're unusual in that we have them in hotels and clubs. So they're very, very accessible. And I know this is a sports betting talk, but you'll see how this comes around hopefully soon. So, we lose more on pokies or slots or EGMs than most other countries lose on per capita on all gambling combined. These are advertised with like VIP lounge signs everywhere showing just how important those players are to revenues. So gambling is very accessible in Australia, and it's a really big part of our activity. In fact, in terms of gambling harm, with EGMs is a big thing. And so this is a recent paper in Journal of Behavioral Addictions, and I really like it. So humor me for a moment while I talk about it. We do have pokies in hotels and clubs everywhere except for one jurisdiction, Western Australia, which only has them in its casino. So a much more restricted environment in Western Australia, and they actually have a higher gambling prevalence, but EGM uptake is about half, and gambling harm is about 1/3 lower than the rest of the country. And attribute this based on a large national data set to this differential access. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because in Australia, we don't have online pokies, online casinos. We've decided to, and online gambling legislation came in, we decided those were not the kind of thing that we should have online. And, there are overseas ones, but offshore aren't meant to offer them to Australians either. So we've got this, situation where pokies are absolutely everywhere, or slots or EGMs are absolutely everywhere, except online. Now, we do have online sports betting and race betting, and you can buy your lottery tickets online. Keno recently became available as well. But in terms of sports betting as well, there are certain restrictions that some US jurisdictions are doing as well. For example, we don't allow live betting on sports. So once a match has started, you can't place a bet online. You have to call to an operator. So this seems possible that we have the more cautious approach to sports betting, given that we have EGMs everywhere. So why do we have these restrictions? Let's look at how we developed in Australia. So the first organised horse race was back in 18. And to place bets, you're allowed to, but you had to go to a course to place them. Up until 1961, legal off-course race betting was. So in that period of 150 years there, the only legal way that you're meant to place to go to a race course and place the bet. But illegal off-course popped up. They had better, because they were illegal, they weren't, and they would come to even frequent, hotels and clubs to take your bet. So 1961, legal off-course race betting, but these were still, there was a state-owned company that did that. Sports betting wasn't legal until 1983, so still sort of 40 years or 35 years ahead of the US there. And then 1993, our first private betting company came around, and just a few years later, Centrebet started with online betting. In 2001, online gambling legislation came in. So also around that time, in the 90s, live betting started to appear. So our legislation was enacted in 2001, and the internet, when live betting was happening, was coming in, looked a lot like this. So the internet wasn't really ready to handle live betting. So that's why we had to make a call. The legislation was brought in with a very cautious approach to online gambling because it was quite new. And same with live betting, it was pretty new. So the legislation said, we'll allow you to bring in slow-paced gambling products for online betting, and sports betting was seen as pretty slow. Live betting seems a bit too fast. We're going to make phone calls, and we've kind of maintained that as well. So what I want to talk about in the rest of the talk is this idea of how technology is changing sports betting in terms of the products that are offered and how they're offered. And also, if I have a moment, the introduction of social elements into online betting as well. Mark mentioned one of the big things here is internet gambling and more recently smartphone betting. So citing some work here led by Professor Neroli Hing, which looked at smartphone betting on sports and some related products as well, like esports and daily fantasy sport, adults. And, it's now easier than ever to place a bet because we've all pretty much got smartphones attached to our hands, right? So this appeals to people who are most at risk, especially impulsive people. And smartphone betting is particularly associated with harm because you can do it in private, you can access it anywhere, anytime, and you have more access to inducements as well, which are associated with higher levels of betting and betting harm. This also leads to, and you know, this access thing is a problem. We've seen with EGMs, like I mentioned earlier, that the level of access is a problem for them. Seems like it is for sports betting as well. This also leads to the potential for loopholes. And here's a really nice example of how gambling operators can be really innovative. There's a product that was brought in 2015 called click to call. Remember, live betting can only be done via the phone, but William Hill brought in this thing where you would call them by connecting to and just turning on your microphone. You wouldn't actually speak to anybody. So is it actually a phone call? Well, legally, maybe it was at the time, but what would actually happen is on a screen, you would sit there and press your selections. You'd have your microphone on. There might be someone on the other end. It might have been a phone call by legal definitions, but it didn't last very long. So this is always the challenge of technology, is foreseeing what the options are and setting legislation up around that. We're also seeing the invention of more dangerous products. So a paper of mine from a few years ago looked at this thing called microbetting. I touched on it before in the answer there. So with old sports betting, so consider these lines here like a bit of a timeline. The line on the left is the start of it, and the right is the end. What you used to have to do was place a bet before the match started, any time before the match started, could be days before it starts. And typically you were betting on something like the outcome of the match, who would win, how much they might win by. More products have come in over time. So there's a big gap there, big time delay between when the outcome becomes known. You can now bet on in-game events. So not who's going to win, but maybe who's going to score first or who's going to be ahead at half time. And also bet live. So now you can place bets after the match started. So if you placed a bet before on a team to win and they're not doing so well, you can try and check or offset that loss with a live bet on the other team as well. And things shorten that gap between place the bet potentially and the outcome of it. The natural progression of that is live betting on in-game contingencies, so an even shorter period, and micro betting or betting on micro events do the same idea, but a tiny time period. In fact, it's really hard to even fit an arrow. So things like betting on the next point. Yes. And this allows people not to, to place a series of bets, so lots of little bets as they go. And now we've moved from sports betting being this slow-paced product that was allowed online in Australia because it was slow-paced into these fast-paced kind of products. US, a lot of jurisdictions are actually bringing these in them. So we had this study on micro betting, and we wanted to see if it is a dangerous form of gambling. So remember micro betting on things like the next point in tennis. So example, the next ball, similar to in baseball. And we had a look at people who didn't bet on micro events. These are regular sports bettors here, the blue lines, and people who do bet on micro events, which is kind of the fluoro-green line or something. CQU colors, they're weird. And we found that, of the people who do bet on micro events, only 5% of them are classified as non-problem gamblers, and a really large 78% were in that highest risk PGSI category. So that's my big finding. I'm going to make a bigger flash. I'm going to really make that stand out for a while there because it's a really big indication that these new products that are coming in appeal to those who are most at risk of harm. Where that becomes tricky, though, is where do you draw the line between a micro, which is bet ball in cricket, for example, and just a standard live bet on an in-play event. So, for example, here's an online operator allowing a bet on an over, which is 6 balls. To draw a legal distinction between a live bet on an in-game event and a micro event. Slightly over 15, I'll wrap up really quickly. One more thing we're seeing is technologies allowed for social elements to come in online betting. So the one put this in 2021 via their betting apps, where you can set up a group of people and you can, bet together. You can all pool your funds and have a little bit of a bet. Now, I'm not going to say I inspired this, but in 2018, we released a paper that sort of said that social influences, and bet are really associated with higher levels of betting and higher levels of harm. Of course, I didn't, inspire the product. But we're seeing, Mark mentioned that online betting has moved from more of a to more of a social thing. And what gambling socially, it can be really difficult to break away from those social influences, especially once that's, what you part of your sort of social identity. There's a lot more to discuss. I'm wrapping up now. How technology and data can be used for harm minimization. We're seeing some really interesting work there on behavioral tracking, linking across accounts, linking data with other stakeholders. So a recent recommendation from a parliamentary inquiry to share data with banks about excluded bettors so that banks can block transactions with gambling operators, for example. Big changes being recommended, always big changes being talked about, and we'll see if they're actually implemented. So takeaway from today is that sports betting was allowed online in Australia because it was originally a relatively slow, I'm not going to say safe, but safer activity. Sports betting is now much higher risk because they're borrowing what's worked from EGMs. Higher accessibility, faster paced are just some of those. Maintain a restricted gambling environment, and there might be some useful lessons here for people, for jurisdictions that are working on legislation. So this is me. There's a QR code there to download the presentation and some of the references for the things I've talked about. And thanks again to the team here, Professor Matthew Rockloff, Professor Matthew Brown, and Professor Nerily Hing, who have been involved or led a lot of the work that I talked about there. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you. There is a question in the chat, and it's a relatively long question, but I think it's a really important one. So there's quite a bit of concern about facial recognition technology, poker machines, slot machines. In Macau, facial recognition technology is combined with artificial intelligence to detect when a player appears bored, and the machine will respond in ways to perk you up and increase engagement. To what extent is this behind the scenes kind of technology used in sports betting, and how much oversight do governments realistically have over new technology being used by the industry?
It's a great question. There's a few things here. So in Australia, a lot of the gambling data for online operators is not readily available. And they might have things that they have in place, say that they might use for responsible gambling tools or for advertising tools or determining who they want to target with ads or even off if they're winning too much. But we don't have any transparency over how any of this works. It's really hard to know. Some of the recent recommendations from the parliamentary inquiry, which are not yet enacted, in things like making these data more visible. But at the moment, all of this stuff happens on a per operator basis. These are private companies and there's very little access to it. So it's very hard to know. We do see, though, that many of them are licensed by the Northern Territory Racing Commission, which makes their complaints public. And we can see that, because a lot of this happens in a black box, there's no transparency. For people to, bring a complaint licensing authority, usually something pretty bad tends to happen. And when you look at these complaints, some of the things that the companies do seem to be, really highly problematic, but they only come out when complaints happen. So, I would say we need a lot more transparency around these things, and I hope that there will be. But, these are private companies and getting them to share data is going to be hard.
And I imagine it will only get more complex over time rather than simpler. So it's really an important evolving area as technology continues to grow in terms of its scope and complexity.
Mm.
I do not see other other questions in the chat. So thank you, Alex. Perhaps then we'll move on to our third presenter, Shane Krause, who is at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas in the US, who will be speaking on the rise of sports wagering in the United States, clinical considerations.
Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and jump in here. Okay, so here we go. So hi everybody. So I'm in Las Vegas, which is actually a really great place to study gambling, since Vegas, really Nevada itself actually had $23 billion in gambling revenue last year. So it's a big place for gambling, lots of casinos. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about sports betting, specifically some of the more recent stuff that's happening here in the US. So of course, I do have disclosures. I have received research funding in the last couple of years for my research. Obviously, my work speaks for myself and not for other funders, but this is supporting some of the work that we're going to talk about. The papers and publications today will be mostly, we're funded from the ICRG for a longitudinal 5-wave sports betting grant that we'll be talking about, and support from the Cambridge Research Institute. So Mark, Dr. Potenza discussed this already, so I'm going to kind of go through this, but just, you know, up into 2018 was kind of the floodgates literally opened in the United States, and sports betting really has been legalized really quickly, but the amount of money that has been handled is over $306 billion. So it is seriously big money here. In Nevada, it's over, you know, they've handled well over $37 billion now. It's quite a bit. The Super Bowl that we just had, actually, the year before, 2023, was $150 million. This last year was $168 million just by Nevada sportsbooks. So it's a big business. As Dr. Penza mentioned, it's the red states. It's really being rolled out pretty quickly across states. Some are trying to legalize it, like Georgia just tried, but had a bill fail to legalize. But as you'll continue to see more and more red throughout the United States as more states attempt to legalize. And, you know, for example, you know, about 29 million people were estimated to gamble on sports books. So it's a lot of people. So I'm going to talk mostly, really briefly, around some of our work that we've done from the international. So the ICRG, we received a sports wagering grant a couple of years ago. It's 5 waves longitudinally. It has a sample of 4,000 US adults. 2,800 are census match, which means we match it based on age, gender, you know, geographic location, United States. So that's really in central, and 1,500 are people who do sports betting. So we oversampled. So this is going to be really baseline data. In the future, we will be looking at longitudinal with 5-point papers looking at sports betting, probably this summer and the fall. So, but we've been lately able to publish a couple of papers I'm going to talk about, which I think represent trends for the United States and things for us clinically to be thinking about. So first question is, who's gambling? So who's our population? And generally right now we're seeing male sports betting is more likely to be younger, more religious, which we're still trying to understand that, higher income, and obviously residing in states where it's illegal is a greater likelihood of engaging in sports betting. And again, every year more and more states are increasing. So again, we should expect participation levels to go up. The other thing too, again, this is looking at, we wanted to look at problem gambling severity scores, so the PGSI, and once again, not surprising that lethality, so if it's legal, as it becomes legal, risk goes up. Also for general sports betting. So if you look at the red, I just kind of capped the areas where I think are more significant for you to look at. So again, general sports bettors, betting itself was associated with increased risk. So was daily fantasy and esports, but again, but we did not see that for fantasy sports bettors. So this first paper, which we published a while ago, was kind of looking at who was doing it, and again, legal, you know, having accessibility in generally sports betting across the board looks like it's associated with increasing risk, which makes sense. So fast forward recently, last year, we said, well, what about, you know, the risks associated with activities? And this is from a paper we published last year in Cambridge in comprehensive psychiatry. And what we really, the takeaway of that paper is that as people do more activities with sports betting, so you have here, you can see one activity, you can see two activities, 3 or 4. What I want you to look at is the kind of, I guess it's more of a bluish color. That's the high risk for PGSI. And what you notice for sports gambling is for sports bettors, that's going up and up as they do more activities. So what that means clinically is if I see someone coming in or might having issues who's reporting more than 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 more activities online for betting, my the hair on my back and the neck might be standing up, because what we're seeing here is that the more activities, the greater the risk for PGSI severity. So if that makes sense. So again, they're doing a lot more activities online and more sports betting, if that makes sense. So another thing that we wanted to look at was substance use. So we know historically problem gambling associated with substance use, lots of psychiatric comorbidity. We know that. So this publication looked at substance use or behavioral problems. And what we found, not surprising, is that past year sports betting frequency was correlated with substance use, which is kind of what we expect, for example, 0.27 with alcohol. So again, those are associated. So this would make sense. We also found it with, cannabis, illicit substances, alcohol, things like that. And also other behavioral issues like, pornography, video gaming, things like that. So this is really just kind of saying, okay, we have a signal. So the next thing we want to do is really we want to look at predicting sports wagering frequency, so how much they're doing it. And we want to look at substance use. And what we found are a couple patterns that I think are useful. So when you look at here, the first bar, you'll see it says past year traditional. So what you're seeing here is these bars are kind of across the board. This is where these behaviors, so it says past year traditional, this is alcohol, this is what the association with is across the substances. So not surprising, you can see traditional sports betting was associated with substance use, so is daily fantasy and esports. So again, this makes sense. So this is predicting substance use frequency. It's a little bit higher for alcohol, and we're going to talk about why that is. But what that means, I think, was that you should be thinking about substance use occurring with sports betting, because it looks like those who do sports betting are higher. So when we look at symptoms of addiction, again, here what we see is something similar pattern. So we're looking across alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, prescriptions, illicit drugs, pornography, and gaming. And so when you see it says targeted behavior frequency, that itself is actually the alcohols, right? So that is how often they're doing that. And what you can see across, again, is the similar correlations I would expect. So they're all 0.3, if not a little bit lower for gaming as well. And again, daily fantasy and esports are a little bit lower, but again, traditional sports betting is a little bit higher. So again, this is kind of giving us a signal that substance use should be something we should be asking and doing research on. So this actually then brought us to look at, we wanted to understand substance use. And this is a paper that just came out recently in JAMA Open Network. And we wanted to look at binge drinking, so we're going to talk about that. And what we did is we wanted to again look at that, and we found that those who are sports bettors are younger, they're likely more likely to be men. But really interestingly, they're more likely to binge drink. Okay, so if you look at here, the binge drink frequency, sports gamblers relative to non-sports bettors or non-gamblers are binge drinking significantly higher for men and for women. So that is really something that I think stood out for us. We're not sure whether they're right now. One of the questions we've collected data on is if they're drinking while engaging in sports betting. I think that is a question we've collected in further waves. This was at baseline, but right away we're seeing high levels of binge drinking, which I think is concerning. Again, moving fast forward here, we're looking at binge drinking frequency. And again, not surprising, in a model, sports gamblers have increased risk of binge drinking frequency as they go up. So again, and this is a signal for both women and for men. Women are on the top. So in a sense, those who are betting more frequently are engaging in more binge drinking itself. So that's concerning given the levels of the risk. So I think that's something for us to think about, particularly when we're screening or working with people with sports betting. Asking and screening for alcohol use, I think, is really, really important here. So this paper just came out today, actually online, but it's about positive play. So positive play is a scale that was developed to look at kind of both protective and potentially risk factors, I think, with problematic gaming. And there's different disciplines or different scales: honesty, control, personal responsibility, gambling literacy, knowledge, right, pre-commitment of your choices. And what we did is we wanted to compare, so of the sample of 4,000, we had 561 to whom we really focused on sports betting. And we wanted to say, well, did positive play differ based on whether they're online players, casino players, or neither? And what we found is only literacy was significantly higher in this case for online only. So really not too much difference. This finding is kind of interesting, but not so much. But it gets more interesting when we start looking at, so we heard earlier about in-game betting, pre-gaming, so setting your limit ahead of time or your wager, get betting while. And what we're seeing, not surprising, is that we're seeing differences in positive play subscales between in-game, so people betting while, or those who actually do pre-game or before. And you can actually see the scores are actually much higher for pre-game versus in-game, which is where the risk is. So this is actually where they gamble. So one of the things we wanted to say is, where are they going? And here you can see DraftKings, FanDuel were probably the largest of those, of the 561 where they were betting. And then so we looked at, again, positive play. And what we found was that lower. So in this case, there's two graphs here. So one is we found, we looked at all of the main places they were betting. So you can see, you know, bet online, FanDuel, DraftKings, so on across the board. You can see that lower gambling literacy was associated with those in red. So across the board, those are the platforms had their players had lower gambling literacy, and also honesty and control was lower among those who do offsite. And then again, if we go look at personal responsibility, we see the only one that had a difference was FanDuel. And then for pre-commitment, we see higher pre-commitment scores for those playing offsite. So it's interesting. I mean, I would say that it's a lot to unpack. I would say that, you know, we're seeing, I think there's really not a standardization around online, you know, in-person casinos and positive play. But I think it's something we should be thinking about where there are gaps. So really close. Role of media influencers are huge in the United States. You know, we have a lot of celebrities endorsing sports betting, but we really don't have a lot of scientific, you know, data on this effects for advertisement for youth and, you know, and young adults, which is really quite problematic. There's lots of really, I think, problematic ad language. For example, you know, you can see here, you know, $200 bonus money, you know, free bet, these things, which is really all distorted and unhealthy and problematic language that should not be occurring. And the scholarship here, so there are some studies that are finding that these sign-up bonuses are really related to high-risk gambling, and advertisement around odds, things like that, really incentivize more for young men to take risk. And there's really not a standardization, really, particularly in the US, around responsible marketing code for sports betting. So I think as we're pulling in more celebrities and things like that, I think we really have that responsibility to understand literacy, you know, people's knowledge online as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stop. I think I went pretty quick, but I think we have some questions as well. Okay.
Thank you. We do have a question in the Q&A.
Great.
It says that it is more of a comment than a question, but there is a question.
Okay.
So Kim et al. Found that religiosity predicts gambling via magical thinking. Research by Taylor and Asis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, found that sports fans engage in high levels of magical thinking. Combined, I believe this offers a possible explanation between young sports bettors and religiosity. Are there other factors that you've discovered that may explain this relationship?
So that's a really good question. So I'm not sure. I think we're curious on this because this was kind of a surprise. I would say longitudinally, you know, the good thing is that we'll have 5 waves of longitudinal. I interestingly spoke to someone from a different religious community from Utah that actually does not have legalized gambling, and they were noticing a lot of their members were also gambling as well. So I'm not sure. I think it's really interesting. I don't know if it's more acceptable, among religious people as something that they can do versus alcohol or a substance use, which might be more, um, not acceptable. I don't really know. That's a really good question. I think we're going to be drilling down on that, definitely in the next, longitudinal papers. But yeah, we were a bit surprised by that kind of, but I don't know. That's a great comment. I don't know that I have a great answer for that as well, though.
Yeah, while some forms of gambling are in culture are incorporated into religious
Mhm.
practices,
Sure.
sports
Yeah.
gambling I don't think is. So
Yeah.
raises questions about the
Mhm.
links, and these are interesting results that I think the data that you have been collecting can provide additional insight into them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the takeaway clinically is to really be looking at screening for gambling and sports betting among those with substance use issues right now. And then also kind of vice versa. I don't know that we have a lot of discussion around alcohol and substance use with gambling. I think that's definitely part of the American culture. As you mentioned, all the advertisement and all that. And I think that might be problematic for live betting and in betting and lots of betting that's happening. So that's a question we're looking at too. So.
Yes, and um, that's also a potential area for prevention, depending on the source of the alcohol and the source of the gambling. Um, and that's been an area that's been changing over time with respect to um, the restriction of free alcoholic beverages.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I think that this may be particularly concerning given different states having, in the United States, having different legal ages for gambling. So some states, 18 is legal for gambling, others 21. Um, and sometimes these states border one another, so people may travel across state lines. And I believe this also holds true in other jurisdictions like Canada. So with young adults, I think that this may be a particular concern, particularly this combination of alcohol use and
Yeah.
gambling behaviors, particularly sports gambling for men.
Yeah, I think that's what's very unique, and it may not be unique to the United States, but just the proliferation amount of money. I mean, we're talking really, really quite a bit of money, and the way it's being portrayed as really risk-free or kind of a minimal risk. And I think that has been just ratcheted up very quickly in the United States, versus Nevada and other states have had some form of sports betting for years, but the many states have just legalized in the last 2 years with really limited to any treatment infrastructure, right? And we know that it takes 2 to 5 years to kind of see the clinical perspective of people seeking treatment. So really, we're not going to probably see the bump for people for another 2 years, but it is coming, I believe. So, yeah.
Yes, concerning. Are there other questions? I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. We can open up the Q&A to all of the presentations and presenters. If people wish to ask questions of anyone, please feel free to type into the Q&A. And my apologies, I am dealing with some flu-like symptoms, so I am doing my best um, to maintain my voice during this process. Any other questions from the panel? And I didn't mean to shut down potential questions by sharing my physical state, right?
I could potentially throw out a discussion point on advertising. So, in Australia, there's a study from a few years ago that shows we have 5 gambling ads on TV than we do alcohol ads, and we're a nation of drinkers. So, that would tell us something. And they're also, we've talked about Shane there as well. It's sort of portrayed as a risk-free kind of um, and everything, or and a social activity. If you don't do it, you're missing out. I'm just wondering if what you're seeing in the US over the last few years with the introduction of it. Are there concerning practices? What you're seeing.
Yeah, I think the thing that I think I'm most concerned, I think the one thing that's kind of scary is that you have massive proliferation, right, which is happening, but you don't really have the infrastructure to set it up. And then you also have massive marketing, and then you're using celebrities and really visible people that really targeted kind of youth, right? Framing it kind of in a way that's risk, a lot of language that's, I think, concerning. I think it's, I always tell people I do lots of different things. And I said, if I went to the store to buy a bottle of wine, but they gave me two free cases of wine, for one bottle, decide to be first time, you'd say, whoa, that's not right. So I think part of it is I think some of the strategies they need to, kind of reunite. We don't really know. I think we have a number of things that we're looking at that I hope in the next year will really drill down on a lot of what you said, because we really want to have that change over time and trajectories, and who started out okay but became with a problem, who developed a problem later, who had a problem but actually naturally got better, we think. So that's what we're hoping to do, and we will be able to do. But I would say that the data we've seen so far forthcoming looks concerning, I think, for some of the online stuff. So I think there will have to be likely some changes coming through, given some of the preliminary work that we're working on. So
Yeah, and in the United States, there was a period of time, say 5 to 10 years ago, before the Supreme Court overturned the professional and amateur, uh, the Protection of Amateur and Professional Sports Act, where daily fantasy sports advertisements were highly frequent. And now those subsided and they're replaced by the sports gambling advertisements, oftentimes from some of the same companies. So we do need to be mindful of multiple things happening in society. One of those events that occurred was the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's a question um, from Alex Blazinski about what has been the impact of the COVID lockdowns on take-up of online gambling, particularly the transition from land-based to online.
Yeah, so from our perspective, we're going to look at that within the change or within several, with time, to see who was land-based and switched to online only. And so that's a research question we're gonna model out. I don't really know. I think there's a lot of new people moving into sports betting that are not in traditional betting, because they're really going after a younger audience. But I'm not really sure in terms of COVID. I think it has changed, but I think that's a question we want to empirically look at. But I think the answer is there's a change. I think there's a shift from what we'll see in the data. So
Yeah, we've done, like, there's a few studies in Australia there. Australia was quite an interesting one because, as you know, with land and what I talked, pokies everywhere, and that was a big thing, is closing. There was that concern about the shift to online. It also sort of worth keeping in mind that there's a general trend towards online anyway. So it's sort of a bit hard to separate that out. I'm just having a look at my list of publications to see if it's out yet. But we've got some stuff not out already. So sorry if I'm ruining someone's publication, which talks about how there was a shift. Like, a lot of people sort of, on pokies and things because they couldn't, but then pretty much bounced back, as soon as it was available. It's sort of worth noting as well that they're quite different forms of gambling. So, pokies versus sports betting. Sports betting, more of an element to it. You generally put some more thought into it, whereas EGMs are a bit more of a mindless kind of thing. That said, people who experience problems tend to gamble on multiple forms anyway. So, it really depends on who we're talking about here. But certainly was a bit of a shift online, but probably in the scheme of a broader shift that's happening anyway. And good to see you, Alex.
Yes. Good to see the name there, and thank you for attending. And my impression has been that while there have been changes to gambling during COVID-19, perhaps they weren't as robust as some people had initially anticipated, and that once the forms of gambling with which people were most familiar or preferred most once they became available seemed like people moved back to those forms of gambling. There are some differences, but if you have to do some broad brushstroke, it's along those lines. But more data to really specify that, because with individuals and their gambling behaviors, even if the numbers stay the same from time A to time B, it's oftentimes different people who are in different categories. So following people longitudinally is really interesting, and one does need large samples to make, I think, informed statements about some of these aspects. So we do have another question about how might gambling affect sports itself, including match fixing and effects on athletes, both pro and amateur.
If you're out, I'll jump in on this one.
Please.
I mean, the biggest thing is the influx of money into the sport. It's bringing money in, which, there's a lot more of a living that can be made from it. But sport can exist without gambling, as opposed to something like racing, which doesn't exist without gambling. So, it's making sports glitzier and because it's attracting, higher caliber players because there's more money there and all that sort of thing. And so, to wean off. In terms of the match fixing, certainly seeing it. It was one of the things we were looking at with COVID. If you remember, right at the start of the pandemic, pretty much all sports stopped the worldwide, except for like Russian table tennis, if that was a thing. I'm kind of imagining all of these like Russian table tennis guys in like the fifth division who've never had any interest in their sport before, probably also getting hit with like match fixing requests as well, and how they had to deal with that. So certain things that can be brought in, like codes of conduct and all that kind of thing, but corruption and gambling and sport has been around for a very long time, especially in Australia. And as I sort of pointed out, some of these products that are around, like fast-paced betting or betting on like a particular event in the game, for more types of corruption and stuff that's harder to do. Yeah, there's problems there.
Yeah, I also think that the more that you can bet within the games and aspects of all the games. I think, talking to some athletes themselves, I think there's a lot of stress because, if you make a mistake and someone says, "Oh, I bet $10,000 on that," the field goal you miss, it's like, it's just a different context. And I think now you can do that, right? You can literally bet on everything. And it's really quite, I think that's also going to create added pressure for folks who are athletes. We're just trying to, in some ways, just play the game, right? Not necessarily have every aspect of what they do, but someone's wagering on. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think part of the question also asked about pro and amateur. And one of the changes that did appear to occur with the shutdown of pro sports during the onset of COVID-19 was an increase in betting on amateur sporting events. But again, once the pro sports came back, returned to the pro sports. And there are some amateur level, or low-level professional groups that become involved in sports gambling and may be particularly vulnerable. So, for example, there was a tennis ring in Europe where that was being investigated, and the tennis players were not making huge amounts of money, but they played well enough to have people be betting on them, and they were seen as, and they probably were vulnerable to becoming involved in throwing games. or matches or sets. So it is something that with new technologies, looking for betting irregularities becomes a more complex process, and more regulatory groups, I believe, are involved in trying to protect the integrity of the sports.
One of the things we're seeing, like particularly around the amateur game as well, is that there are people who are hired to go with a tripod and their phone and a little device that records, amateur games. Like I'm talking like me playing a cricket team, and those markets become available for betting. Now, I'm not answerable to anybody in terms of corruption and things like that. And to be honest with you, knowing my cricket team, if someone comes up and says, I'll give you $1,000 to throw the match, the rest of the guys would go, yeah, take it. So there's, there's is that a thing? Like, one of the things about sports betting is that, there's that degree of skill there. You're sort of showing with your mates that you know a bit more about the sport and you've worked out who's going to win and you found an edge or whatever. How do you have that with a bunch of guys who are still drunk from the night and playing a social game? That a product that can be bet on, and there's no integrity there. So, yeah, just there seems to be this idea of just more and more and more purely for the sake of more and more, with no real thought about why that's.
And there is a question here too about, given that sports bettors skew male, are there gender-specific patterns and factors associated with problem sports betting? Do we know how they differ yet? And I think, Shane, you were presenting some
Yeah,
data.
I mean, I think so. Yeah, I think so far we're seeing similar patterns in terms of substance use. I think there's a pretty significant big gender difference, but I have a feeling that women are going to catch up. So I think we should not overly assume that it's going to be only male forever, particularly as women's basketball college did amazing and it got a lot of people very involved. And I think that I think we're going to see some trends that will probably change. I think what we got to do is be really careful, because if we think it's only certain groups, then we put intervention to those groups where we're not really being fluid and understanding. So I don't really know. I don't have anything off the top of my head. I would say I think we've seen higher levels of impulsivity, some work research that we're doing, but yeah, I don't know that there's anything stands out too much for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, all the advertising here really skews male as well, and it skews young, which I think, like the point you mentioned, the impulsivity was what I had in my head. Particularly young men, we do dumb stuff young, and I don't know how half of us survive, to be honest. So, it's ripe for getting vulnerable people, and it's targeted to vulnerable people. And it's not just that they're young and male, it's what comes with that as well, like the impulsivity too. So as well, we shouldn't, not be looking at older audience. Younger people don't tend to have the same kind of responsibilities as older people do, like mortgages, families, that not always, but just, broad brush strokes. And certainly the gender thing is coming in. Really nice example there that you mentioned. So yes, but I think impulsivity is the big one, and we see that consistently coming out as a really strong predictor of gambling problems, and that's exactly where sports betting is targeted and advertised at the moment. So yeah.
Yeah, and if we look at the gambling helplines in the United States, the increase has been predominantly related to males, young males with sports gambling problems. And the calls are not necessarily coming from the young males themselves, oftentimes from a concerned parent. And usually that's the mother who is concerned about her son's sports gambling. And, it's important to be mindful that this affects families and women and men in complex manners. So it's not just the individual with the sports gambling problem, but also those around the individual, and understanding the impacts more broadly is also really important, and providing help not only for the identified individual with the sports gambling problem, but also whether family counseling, whether having, for example, the mother come in for help, either gambling related, like Gam-Anon related referrals, or help with setting limits on finances, but also affective concerns among affected others, people who are indirectly affected, is common. And I often saw spouses or parents in treatment for the stress and anxiety that their loved ones' gambling behaviors were generating or contributing to. So it's important to keep in mind the larger group of individuals and how they may be impacted by sports gambling.
Yeah, throw out a quick as well. On the call, I can see the recently graduated Dr. Kathy Tulloch in our lab here, and our newest postdoc who did a lot of work and continue work on that space as well. So I can point you to, if anyone wants to reach out, I can point you towards any of her publications on that too. And of course, heaps of other people are doing great stuff, but she's there and I saw her.
All right, are there other questions? If there are no other questions, I'd like to thank our presenters. I'd also like to thank Andy, who has been behind the scenes, making sure that everything goes well. And it's really early in the morning in Europe, so very grateful for her involvement. And thanks everyone who attended for a lively set of questions. And I wish everyone a good morning, good day, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you all.